Hello, I'm Kenny from Malbot, here once again at Strangel to talk about cheap versus expensive lenses. Now, we here are big fans of the Epicurious Show price points, so we're just going to completely steal the idea outright, and we are going to show you two cameras, this one and this one, that are both using incredibly different lenses. One of them is one of the most expensive lenses in the world, and the other one is one of the cheapest lenses in the world. So it's a little difficult to tell here which one's which, maybe in a studio setting on white, but they're both Amiras. They're both running at 4K, so you're gonna see all the details that you could possibly want. And they're both, set up exactly the same. We figured Arri was a good baseline because everyone kind of has an idea of what that is supposed to look like. So we're gonna go outside, we're gonna put the lenses through their paces, show our expert, and they will take us through what they think is what, and what they're looking for when comparing lenses. So we're gonna go on a journey of discovery today, and also in the future, here comes our version of a show that we're gonna have to come up with a different name for.
Hi, I'm Matthew Duclos from Duclos Lenses, and I'm a lens technician and lens geek. So today I'm going to look at the footage from two different lenses. One I'm told is cheap and one I'm told is very, very expensive. And hopefully I can determine which one is which, strictly based on the image. There's a ton of other stuff that goes into what a lens is worth. The build quality, the usability, the size and weight, the reliability, all those other factors. Today I'm just going to look at the end result, the footage that came from these two lenses. So I'm going to look, primarily I'm looking at flaws like chromatic aberration. I'm going to look for the quality of the bokeh. So this is the second one. It's jumping back and forth. This one's a lot cleaner right now in terms of CA, which isn't a dead giveaway. I've still seen a lot of cinema lenses that have a lot of CA. So chromatic aberration will be where the light coming through the back of the lens is not converging at the same point for different points in the spectrum. So you'll see a shift sort of on your edges, your really contrasty spots. You'll see a purple or a green color because it's not focusing at the same point as the other colors. And it's really distracting. It can be used creatively, but usually it's a pretty undesirable flaw. So this one right now, this scene, I see a lot of green on the bench here in the bokeh and on the details. That's kind of a telltale sign. The bokeh is significantly different between the two. Bokeh is the Japanese word that there isn't really an equivalent in English, so we've adopted the word bokeh, and it is the quality of the out of focus portions of your image. So anything that's not in focus has bokeh, or it is bokeh. There are good and bad bokeh. It's extremely subjective. Some people love the really complex, really busy bokeh, or the swirly bokeh. Traditionally in motion picture work, you want a pleasing, subtle bokeh. So you want it to be smooth and simple, relatively non-distracting. This bottom right one here is way more busy. And then this top one is a lot creamier. It's a lot more smooth and consistent. In terms of contrast and sharpness, I don't see a huge difference in this particular shot. Contrast is how quick and how well a lens reproduces blacks and whites. So if you have a lens with low contrast, generally you're gonna see that it has higher black levels. So instead of deep, deep black, it'll be sort of a gray color or gray tone. And then same thing with the highlights, but you usually don't notice it in the highlights. And you would think that higher contrast would be a better feature, but a lot of cinema lenses actually have slightly lower contrast. There's a big difference between the contrast in your image and micro contrast, which is what makes up sharpness, part of what makes up sharpness. So the contrast that we're talking about when I was looking at the footage was the overall contrast, which in a cinema lens, you kind of want it to be a little bit lower. So same thing here, this bokeh is really busy. I don't know what the technical term for it is, but you notice the center of the bokeh is darker than the outside of the bokeh. And then this one, it's more consistent. I thought it was weird before that the bench looked purple, but it actually is purple, so that's good to know. Yeah, so this is the really busy one. And I think that's something that's really good to clarify, is that they're obviously very different lenses. I wouldn't say that one is better or worse. The other thing I'm looking at is how smooth the focus pull is. See, that was kind of jumpy. So I'm inclined to say that this is a cheaper lens with a less sophisticated focus mechanism. Maybe I'm screwing myself here early, but this would be the cheaper lens, this would be the more expensive lens. There's also a pretty significant difference in the quality of the bokeh, not just the texture of it, but the shape. This is a little more, it sort of follows the circular pattern of the lens. This one's more circular throughout, which would imply it's a more circular iris. Iris shape is extremely important. So the iris is what is your aperture, your opening. When you stop down, you're closing your aperture, you're closing your iris. And a lot of people like to pay attention to the number of blades in a lens. And I've been preaching for years that the number of blades isn't as important as the shape of the blades. You can have 16 blades and they can all have a really sharp edge, and it's gonna instill that shape on your bokeh. So when you go out of focus, it will take on the shape of your iris. If you have a really high quality iris that's designed well and it maintains a circular shape, even when you stop down, your bokeh stays circular. If your iris is a hexagon or an octagon or whatever the case is, a triangle in some of the vintage lenses, your bokeh will take on that shape, which can be extremely distracting. Again, subjectively, depending on who you ask. Do you know what T-stop or F-stop these were shot at?
We shot them as wide open as the cheaper one would go, which was like a 1.8.
So another thing I noticed really quick, because we're in this racking focus, this one, the one that I prematurely decided was the cheaper lens, it breathes a lot. Significantly. And this one is pretty solid when you rack back and forth, which again implies that that one is the more expensive. The top left one here is the more expensive. Focus breathing is actually pretty misunderstood a lot of the time. Focus breathing is where you rack focus. You know, in some of these frames, you've got the woman in the front, and then you've got the buildings in the background. So you're focused on the woman, and then you rack focus to the background, the building in the background. Your entire image looks as though it's breathing in and out, you know, zooming, a very subtle zoom. And that's something that lens manufacturers strive to correct for. Something like a Canon L series zoom is not going to correct for focus breathing. When you rack focus, it's going to go in and out a lot. A proper cinema lens is going to correct for that, and you won't even notice it. Yeah, see, like this whole frame stays solid when you rack from the woman to the background, whereas this one's just going all the way in and out. So if one of them is wide open and one of them is stopped down, that's actually a little bit unfair, because whichever one is wide open is going to have a perfectly circular bokeh, because there's no blades to influence the bokeh, whereas the one that's stopped down is going to take on the shape of the aperture. See, this looks perfectly circular. So this, maybe it is stopped down and it just has a really good iris with a nice shape to it, which is kind of the idea of a high quality cinema lens. This is the one with the busy bokeh. That's much cleaner bokeh. The flares are nice on both. This one's a lot more washed out, which is not a bad thing. That's not really telling either way. I'm trying to look for something like a really high contrast. So we've got a lot of flare, a lot of glare, like veiling glare, which is kind of hides some of those flaws like chromatic aberration. So I'm trying to find a really high contrast portion where chromatic aberration would stick out. Flares, again, are extremely subjective. There's good flares, there's bad flares, there's all sorts of flares. There's specular highlight flares, there's the flare from a sun, the spots on the lens where you get the green and purple stacked rings that go through the lens or through the image. Personally, my preference is to have a nice low contrast veiling flare. And you have others that are just a big sunspot right in the middle of your image. This one has a little more CA in the flare itself, so it's a little more purple, which would again imply that this one is lower priced. It's hard to say, because a simple observation, you can have something like a Master Prime and then a really expensive vintage lens. And they could be priced similar, but they'll have completely different results. So you guys gave me no clues. Okay, there you go. That was, so like this, all of this right here, I see a bunch of green chromatic aberration, and in this one there's practically nothing. There it is again. Purple on her head there, and now it's gone. So I'm gonna say that's the higher price in this clip. Are you guys gonna tell me what they are at the end? Okay, good. This flare, so that's another interesting one. The flare on this bottom one is a lot more streaky. Like when you have that specular highlight, that sun, all this right here, it's really streaky. And this one, it maintains a lot cleaner. It's just sort of this really nice washed out flare, which is really beautiful. And this one's just kind of very distracting. Very distracting.
I have accidentally switched those two.
Oh, I was just gonna say,
Yeah.
I was gonna say it's misleading. So this one is a lot higher contrast. So it is, yeah, that makes perfect sense. This one looks more expensive now because your blacks are blacker, everything is more crisp. Whereas this one, it's got the really distracting flare. The highlights, I'm sorry, the shadows are kind of washed out. Again, not a bad thing, it's just a little more telling. I think that's actually pretty important to note that when it comes to lenses, cheap doesn't always mean worse. I always say there's no bad lens. There's the right lens for the right job. Okay, see now it's telling. All right, this is gonna be interesting right here. You gave me a hint in saying that one was faster, so you had to stop down, which I'll assume is the more expensive one. This is the busier, sort of more complex bokeh, and you could tell in the center, it's a nice clean circle, and then the outside, you get sort of that cat eye or the football shape, which means that this is the slower, cheaper one, stopped wide open. This one, you can just barely start to see the shape of the iris. So it's stopped down just a touch, which means this was faster and you had to stop down to match it. See, that's another thing that's really tricky about this is you can take, especially these days, you could take a really cheap, like a Sigma art lens and get beautiful results. And then you could take a $100,000 Fujinon and you'd argue to see which one was cheaper or more expensive just on the optics. Oh, that's, yeah, that bokeh is cheaper, we'll say. Ah, here's the CA. This is a perfect highlight. It's black hair and the white background. All of this, lots of CA, lots of flare over here. All of this hazing around it. I'm gonna say that's the cheaper one. I haven't even seen the other one. I'm gonna say that's the cheaper one. And that's a lot more higher quality bokeh. It's cleaner, it's smoother. All of your transitions are nice and clear. Yeah, almost no CA in here, or the really high contrast spot. Here we go. Yeah, almost no CA. And this is all pretty well maintained. So it's a lot more consistent. So, okay, I'm gonna give some quick observations. This is a perfect example. This one could just be a slightly older lens that's still really, really expensive. It could be something like, a K35 or a Super Speed, something like that, that's really expensive. And this one, even though it performs a lot better, it could be something brand new. So it's kind of hard to say which one's worth more, which is an interesting observation in our industry as a whole, because the value of a lens, it's really what the user gives it. Okay, so now I have some questions. We're good?
Yeah.
Okay, this one, country of origin.
Japan.
Okay. And this one?
Germany.
Okay. Vintage?
No.
No, both produced this year.
This year. Okay, so both brand new lenses.
Yes.
Okay, Germany. Is there any tricks, like one's rehoused or?
No.
They're both as they are.
Yep.
And you can buy them from the brand new.
Correct.
Okay. Is it a lens that Duclos Lenses sells?
One of them, yes.
One of them, yeah.
Okay. The Japanese or the German one?
I'm gonna have to say the
German one.
German one.
What Japanese lens don't we sell? Oh, okay. So it's a still lens.
Yes.
Okay. I'm gonna say that this, where is it? This one, it's Japanese and it's new. Focal length. Give me the focal length.
They're both 50.
And they're both a prime?
Correct.
So it's slow. So this is probably a Canon 50, like the Nifty, like a 51.8. And this one, the higher quality one, it's probably like a Leica, maybe Thalia, or no, it can't be a Thalia because that's too slow. You said you had to stop it down, so it's like a Summilux, something like that. Those are my loose guesses. A Canon 51.8.
I'll say you nailed that. The Canon
Okay.
that's exactly what it is.
Okay, hold on then. The other one I did not nail.
No.
Super 35 or full frame?
Super
Super 35.
And it's German. It's a 50 Prime, most expensive. So Master Prime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that was everything that I noticed was pretty obvious. All of the features, all of the the quality of the bokeh, the lack of CA. It makes a pretty significant difference. And that's just from my observation perspective. I can imagine from a user perspective, which is when I first started talking to you guys, that's half the battle. Consuming this, the results of this is one thing. Creating this is a whole nother thing. This would be completely different between using a Canon still lens and shooting with a Master Prime. They're completely different user experiences.
I can tell you for sure the biggest struggle was pulling focus on that
Yep.
tiny little Canon guy.
Which I could tell in some of them, like when she's walking back and forth,
Yeah.
you can see you're kind of hunting, it's kind of jumping a little bit at a time, whereas the Master Prime definitely would have been a much smoother, more consistent, precise focus pull.